In 2013, the year after the organization decided to part ways with their star caliber forward Andre Iguodala, the Philadelphia 76ers would hire Sam Hinkie as their new general manager and will begin what will become one of the most infamous practices in NBA and even sports history. As Sam Hinkie decided to make it publicly known that he was going to purposely lose as many games as possible in order to put the team in a more favorable position to receive higher draft odds, in a process that will become known as tanking. This obviously came with its fair share of criticism. However, Sam Hinkie was very optimistic about this approach, and in the words that will become synonymous with the 76ers for the next near decade, all Sam Hinkie asked from the 76ers fans was to trust the process. What is going on, YouTube? It is the one and only Jared the Analyst. And as most of you are aware, the Philadelphia 76ers have yet again come up short in the postseason, which has made it the fourth time in the last 5 years that this team has fallen short in the second round. And very similar to what I did with the Boston Celtics last year, I wanted to make a video highlighting how the 76ers got to this point, and then go ahead and give my thoughts on what the team should do moving forward. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and begin our journey. So flashback to the summer of 2014, and the 76ers had just finished with the second worst record in the NBA. And going into the 2014 draft, the 76ers were looking for a front-court player to pair up with their impressive young guard in Michael Carter-Williams, who had just taken home the 2014 Rookie of the Year honors. And after acquiring the third pick in the draft, the 76ers would use that selection to draft a 7-foot center out of the University of Kansas by the name of Joel Embiid. Embiid was one of the standouts of the Big 12 Conference, being named not only to the All-Big 12 freshman team and freshman defensive team, but to the entire Big 12 freshman and defensive team, as well as being named the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. Unfortunately, though, days before the draft, Embiid underwent surgery to repair a stress fracture in his foot, which would cause him to miss the entire 2014-2015 season. But this, oddly enough, played right into Sam Hinkie's philosophy, as with Embiid missing the entire season, this was yet another opportunity for the 76ers to tank and to try to get favorable draft odds in the following year's draft. So, that's exactly what they did, finishing the 2014-2015 season with just an 18-64 record. And just as a side note, they would end up participating in a 3-team trade at the trade deadline that would see them send Michael Carter-Williams to the Bucks and receive a 2018 draft pick from the Phoenix Suns. Moving on into the 2015 draft, though, they again were looking to select a big man and decided to go with Jahlil Okafor with the third overall pick. Okafor, like Embiid, was a standout big man who in his one season with Duke was named the ACC Player of the Year, the ACC Rookie of the Year, along with making the ACC All-Freshman Team, the All-ACC Team, and winning a national championship. Now moving into the 2015 offseason, before we get to the actual season, the 76ers would end up participating in another trade that I wanted to highlight. On July 9th, 2015, the 76ers participated in a trade that would send two players who never played a game in the NBA, along with the first-round pick in the 2017 draft, to the Sacramento Kings for Carl Landry, Nick Stauskas, Jason Thompson, and a 2017 first-round pick. However, the 76ers would have the right to swap picks if they chose to move up in the draft. So now we can get into the 2015-2016 season and hopefully start to see the process get underway. But yet again, before the season was able to get underway, it was revealed that Joel Embiid would have to miss time due to a setback in the healing process of his foot injury. But this is fine because this is the whole reason why the 76ers selected Jahlil Okafor. And to Okafor's credit, in the time while he was available, he posted up really solid numbers, giving you 17.5 points with 7 rebounds while shooting 51% from the field is an excellent start for a rookie, and Okafor was even rewarded by making an all-rookie team. But notice that I said in the time that he was available, because Jahlil Okafor will only end up playing 53 games this year. But, once again, this oddly enough played right into what Sam Hinkie had envisioned for this team, as this definitely was the most extreme version of the tanking. In this season, the 76ers would finish the season with a whopping 10 wins, yes, 10 wins, and not surprisingly, win the first pick in the 2016 NBA draft. Unfortunately, though, for Sam Hinkie, the 76ers had had enough of this tanking philosophy, and they relieved him of his duties before he could see his process through. Now heading into the draft with Michael Carter-Williams gone, it was clear that with their front court established, they were going to need some perimeter players to add on to their developing team. So with the first pick in the 2016 NBA draft, the 76ers were going to select a 6'10" point forward out of LSU by the name of Ben Simmons. Now, Simmons was not only the number one pick, but he was the number one prospect in all of college basketball, as in his lone season at LSU, Simmons averaged 19 points, 12 rebounds, and 5 assists, while shooting 56% from the field as a perimeter player. This to go along with Jahlil Okafor and Joel Embiid, who was now finally starting to seem like he'd make a return in the coming season, was enough to get Sixers fans hopeful and excited for their future. But, as seemed to be the case for the 76ers, the injury bug would strike yet again. Ben Simmons would end up breaking his foot during training camp and would be ruled out for the entirety of the 2016-2017 season. Then there's Jahlil Okafor, who would once again miss around 30 games while seeing a noticeable decrease in production. And Joel Embiid, who finally made his NBA debut this year and played outstanding in the time that he played, would only play 31 games due to a meniscus tear that he would suffer during the middle of the season. Also, as a side note, in November of 2016, the 76ers would trade Jeremy Grant to the Thunder for Ersan Ilyasova and a 2020 first-round pick. At the end of the 2017 season, the 76ers would finish with a 28-54 record, which was an improvement, but obviously still a long way to go to get the ball rolling. However, though, entering the 2017 draft, the 76ers would still have a top 5 pick, as if you remember, they received this pick in the trade I mentioned with the Sacramento Kings. To further add on to that, in a shocking move, Danny Ainge, the general manager of the Boston Celtics, would go on to trade the first overall pick in the draft, which the Celtics had acquired in that Brooklyn Nets trade, to the Philadelphia 76ers in exchange for the third pick. So for the second year in a row, the Sixers would have the first overall pick in the draft, and in need of a guard, they would select standout Markelle Fultz out of the University of Washington. And if you're wondering about the picks that the Sixers traded to the Kings and the Celtics, Boston would go on to select Jason Tatum, while the Kings would select De'Aaron Fox. Now in the 2017 offseason, and after signing players such as Amir Johnson and JJ Redick, re-signing Joel Embiid, and with Embiid and Simmons finally healthy, the Sixers had completed their rebuild and would begin to put the process into action. Except, not quite. See, in a situation that even to this day very few people understand, Markelle Fultz suffered a mysterious injury that sidelined him for a majority of the season, and even in the games that he did play, he just simply wasn't that productive. But outside of that though, the 2017-2018 season was a step in the right direction for the Sixers. They started by trading Jahlil Okafor to the Nets in order to give the reins completely to Joel Embiid and simply allowed the team to flourish in their new system. And for the most part, it worked. Simmons was healthy, Embiid stayed relatively healthy, and both performed at levels that elevated this team to heights that hadn't been seen since the early 2000s. Not to mention contributions from JJ Redick and Robert Covington, and the 76ers would notch 52 wins and finish with the third seed in the Eastern Conference, making the playoffs for the first time since 2012. They were so impressive that they'd go on to have people considering them to be the favorite to come out of the Eastern Conference.
You just can't say enough about them. Size, youth, fresh legs, athleticism, perimeter shooting, and a willingness to defend. That's why I've got them coming out of the East.
They would match up with the Miami Heat in the first round, and after having 6 players who averaged double-digit points throughout the series, they would end up winning the series in 5 games and look to be on their way to a finals appearance. And to Stephen A's credit, at that point in time, that was a logical conclusion to come to.
Yeah, I heard you say that they're your pick now. What gives you the confidence that they can take 2 more steps and get to the NBA Finals?
The combination of the way they play defense, the way they shoot perimeter shots, and what's left in the Eastern Conference. Let me count the ways. If you're LeBron and the Cleveland Cavaliers, you're a one-man wrecking crew, and there's nobody else helping you. If you're Indiana, Oladipo is a star. Everybody else is suspect. They've got ability, but they wouldn't beat the Sixers. If you look at the Washington Wizards, John Wall or Bradley Beal, who else? Because you never know who else is going to show up. You look at the Toronto Raptors, DeMar DeRozan is a star. Kyle Lowry can literally ball, but he's miniature, and against their size, it could be problematic for him. And then, of course, there's the Milwaukee Bucks who can't shoot. Other than a Greek freak in Middleton, what you're going to get from anybody. And last but not least is the Boston Celtics. We all know they're formidable. We all know they have an exceptional young coach. We look at the bodies that they have. Jaylen Brown is a young star in this league. Jason Tatum will be, but without Gordon Hayward and the great Kyrie Irving, you are shorthanded, which means that you're not going to beat the 76ers.
And speaking of the Celtics, the 76ers would end up matching up with the young team in the second round, who, like Stephen A. just stated, were without Kyrie Irving and Gordon Hayward. But this, however, is where the very glaring issues of this team would start to rear its head. See, one thing I forgot to mention about Ben Simmons was that he couldn't shoot. And not even that he couldn't shoot, he just flat out would not shoot the ball outside of the paint. Which, when you have Joel Embiid, who granted could space the floor, but was much better utilized in the post, playing alongside a primary ball handler who caused defenders to sag off of him and defend the post a lot better, you have a problem. This problem will be highlighted most in Game 2, as Joel Embiid would have a rough night, shooting 36% from the field, and Ben Simmons, in a game of cruel foreshadowing, would play 30 minutes while only shooting 0 for 4 from the field and recording one single point. The 76ers would go on to lose in 5 games, despite being heavily favored, and although they did receive their criticism, most people just chalked it up to them being young and just needing to gain more experience. Now entering the 2018 offseason, and the Sixers were looking to add more talent to their team. And then looking ahead into the draft, they had the opportunity to do so, because if you remember, they acquired the Suns pick in this draft back when they traded Michael Carter-Williams. The Suns ended up with a 21-61 record in 2018, which gave the Sixers the 10th pick in this draft. And with this pick, they would go on to select Mikal Bridges, and then later on they would select Landry Shamet with the 26th pick. 2 players who we now know have turned out to be quality shooters in the NBA, and in the case of Mikal Bridges, has also gone on to become one of the best defenders in the NBA. But as we know, Mikal Bridges would not see the success with the 76ers, as the front office would trade Mikal Bridges ironically to the Phoenix Suns for Zaire Smith, which obviously begs the question as to why the Sixers would trade for the pick if they were just going to trade it back a couple seasons later. But in fairness, Sam Hinkie was the one who traded for the pick, and like I just stated before, he was no longer a part of the organization. Still though, Mikal Bridges has blossomed into a quality 3-and-D starter in the NBA, and even ended up finishing second in Defensive Player of the Year voting this past season. So now we move into the 2018-2019 season, which was relatively the same for Philly, as they looked to improve upon the foundation they had already established. They looked to do this with the 2 pivotal acquisitions they made this year, the first coming in November. At this time, Jimmy Butler was growing increasingly frustrated with the Timberwolves organization, as they were simply on different timelines. The core of this team in Towns and Wiggins were still young and developing, while Jimmy was in the prime of his career and looking to compete for a championship. So on November 12, 2018, the Sixers would trade Jared Bayless, Robert Covington, and Dario Saric to the Timberwolves, and in return, the 76ers acquired Justin Patton and, of course, Jimmy Butler. And after the trade, the Sixers would go 20-11 throughout the next 2.5 months, which helped put them in the conversation yet again of the favorites to come out of the Eastern Conference. Then at the trade deadline, to put the finishing touches on their team and to add a bit more shooting to their roster to try and comfort Embiid and Ben Simmons, Philly decided to go out and trade Landry Shamet, Mike Muscala, and Wilson Chandler to the Clippers, while getting back Mike Scott, Boban, and Tobias Harris. Right after, they would trade Markelle Fultz to the Magic, who at this point was a lost cause and simply just needed to be on a rebuilding team that would allow him to recover fully. And this really put Philly over the edge. And with Embiid and Ben Simmons both improving to become all-stars this year, it looked like Philly was ready to make their championship push. They ended the season with a 51-31 record, which again awarded them the third seed in the Eastern Conference, and they would match up with the Brooklyn Nets in the first round. Yet again, like the previous year, they would have 6 players averaging double-digit points to calmly win the series in 5 games. They would end up facing the Toronto Raptors in the second round, who featured a very similar team as the year prior, albeit one very big difference. And seeing as the Raptors only had one true superstar, matching up against 3 to 4 all-star caliber players, it again, like the previous year, was safe to assume that the 76ers were on hand to make another finals push. The Big Four would do their best to play off of one another, and by the end of Game 3, they had a 2-1 lead. This unfortunately was the turning point, as Toronto would go on to steal Game 4, backed by an amazing performance from Kawhi Leonard and a no-show from Joel Embiid, who only took 7 shots throughout the game. Then in Game 5, they got blown off of the floor, as Jimmy Butler was the only one of the Big Four to score over 15 points, but even then he only shot 37% from the field. Fortunately though, they bounced back in Game 6, backed by great games from Ben Simmons and Jimmy Butler, and even though Joel Embiid only had 17 points, he recorded a ridiculous plus 40 in the box plus minus. The Sixers would go on to win by 10 in a must-win Game 6 and force a Game 7 back in Toronto. And this game, as we all know, would end up being one of the most iconic games in NBA history, but unfortunately not for anything that the 76ers did. See, although the Raptors and the Sixers both struggled from the field, Kawhi Leonard stood amongst everyone and was not going to allow the Raptors to be eliminated. He would end up dropping 41 points, hitting timely shot after timely shot, but of course, sealing the game off with one of the greatest shots in NBA history to steal the game and the series from the 76ers and to send them home in the second round for the second consecutive season. This obviously was a very tough loss for the 76ers, but a loss that was interpreted in many different ways. On one hand, people could obviously be very critical of the Sixers, again being the favorites and leading the series, yet unable to close out and again being sent home. On the other hand, you had some that could argue that even though they lost, they were only a lucky bounce away from going on into overtime and possibly closing it out then. And even if they did lose in overtime, they did take the eventual NBA champions to a 7-game series, which is no small task. But there were some, like myself, that argue that this team was just simply too crowded. If you looked at each game in the playoffs, you'd notice that each of the 4 stars were only attempting around 10 to 15 shots per game, and this was to accommodate for each other being on the court together. More than likely, the 76ers were going to have to make a decision about who to keep between Tobias and Jimmy Butler during the offseason and fill the rest of the team out with quality role players. We now go into the 2019 offseason, and Philly decided to re-sign Tobias Harris to a Supermax deal and do a sign and trade with Jimmy Butler to the Miami Heat, which would see them receiving Josh Richardson to again help out space the floor. They went and signed Al Horford to a very big deal, and unfortunately, due to the excessive money that they offered to Tobias Harris and Al Horford, the front office ended up lowballing JJ Redick and just allowing him to walk to New Orleans for nothing. Besides that, and now getting into the 2019-2020 season, this would again be another solid year for the team, as both Embiid and Simmons were again selected as All-Stars, and up until the season was postponed, the Sixers had a 39-26 record. Once the season was resumed though, Ben Simmons would unfortunately suffer a knee injury that would take him out for the remainder of the season, to which Philly now really didn't stand a chance in the playoffs. They would end up getting swept by the Celtics in the first round, and at this point, there were very few bright spots about this team. They had 2 overpaid players, Ben Simmons was starting to plateau offensively, both Embiid and Simmons were injury prone, and with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant injured, and the Toronto Raptors losing Kawhi Leonard in the offseason, the Eastern Conference was probably as wide open as it was going to get. Yet, the Sixers again missed an opportunity and would have to answer these abundance of questions in the offseason. And interestingly enough, Jimmy Butler, the player that they had just decided to part ways with in free agency, ended up leading the Miami Heat to the NBA Finals. And now at this point, it should be noted that there have been some serious questions about head coach Brett Brown's future with the organization and for the entire organization as a whole, because the 76ers were about to go through some major changes. And many people, including myself, believed that this team wouldn't be able to reach their full potential with Brett Brown at the helm. So it was even more confusing once they fired Brett Brown and then decided to bring in Doc Rivers, who was fresh off of blowing a 3-1 lead as the Clippers head coach. However, Philly fans were optimistic, even more so once Elton Brand was removed from the front office and former Rockets general manager Daryl Morey stepped into the role. And rightfully so, as Morey was able to move Josh Richardson to Dallas and in return receive Seth Curry, who is one of the best floor spacers in the NBA. Then they signed Dwight Howard and moved off of Al Horford's contract. And last but not least, with the 21st pick in the 2020 NBA Draft, which if you remember, they received this pick from the Thunder back in 2016 when they traded Jeremy Grant, and they'd go on to select Tyrese Maxey. Now with everyone healthy for the season, a new coach, a new general manager, and floor spacing to help cater to the play styles of Embiid and Simmons, this seemed again like this was the year that the Sixers would make something happen. And again, to their credit, this team was very good this year. Joel Embiid had elevated his play once again and was now performing at an MVP caliber level. Ben Simmons, although he really wasn't doing much differently offensively, defensively, he was performing at Defensive Player of the Year levels. Doc Rivers seemed to unlock the hidden potential of this team that Brett Brown was unable to achieve, and rookie Tyrese Maxey was starting to show flashes of a potential star caliber player. Overall, this team was performing at new heights, and by the end of the season, they'd finished with a 49-23 record, with the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference. Again, it was safe to say that the Clippers were one of, if not the favorites to come out of the East, or at least make it to the conference finals, seeing as how they ended up on the side of the bracket without Milwaukee, Brooklyn, Boston, or the Miami Heat. So we now get into the 2021 playoffs, and in the first round, the 76ers match up with the Washington Wizards, who featured Bradley Beal and Russell Westbrook, but obviously weren't that good of a team. And like 2019 and 2018, they would get past them in 5 games with a great series from Embiid, Curry, Simmons, and Tobias Harris. This now matched them up with the Atlanta Hawks in the second round, who although had a solid team, didn't match up well on paper with Philly. But as we've seen from this team, it doesn't really matter if they're favored on paper or not, as they still have yet to make it to the conference finals. This was also further proven once the Hawks stole Game 1 in Philly, but the Sixers bounced back and took the next 2 games to take a 2-1 lead. They then lost the next 2 games, and in Game 4 in particular, Joel Embiid went 0 for 12 in the second half of a game that was only decided by 3 points. But thankfully, the Sixers would win Game 6 and force a Game 7. But this time, it would be back in Philly. And in a game where Trae Young went 5 for 23 from the field, and Joel Embiid had 31 and 11 while shooting 52% from the field, you would have thought that the 76ers would have prevailed. But you'd be sadly mistaken. See, this time it was Ben Simmons, who I didn't mention, but ended up going his 4th game in a row without even attempting a shot in the 4th quarter. I will repeat that again just in case you don't clearly understand what I just said. This Game 7 was the 4th game in a row in this series that Ben Simmons did not even attempt a shot in the 4th quarter. And in a game decided by only 7 points, the 76ers would experience deja vu, losing to an inferior team and still being unable to reach the conference finals. But here's the thing. If you've really been paying attention, then the issues that this team was showing really shouldn't have surprised you all that much, because these were things and issues that they were showing back in 2018. Ben Simmons' unwillingness to shoot was not a new issue. This was something that he had shown back in his 1-point game in 2018. Joel Embiid being injury prone is something that we knew since literally the day he was drafted. And the fact that Embiid and Simmons fundamentally didn't fit together was something that was apparent in their entire tenure together. To make matters worse though, in the post-game interview after Game 7, Joel Embiid and Doc Rivers had some questionable answers to some questions that presumably threw Ben Simmons under the bus. And after these comments were made, Ben Simmons would make it publicly known that he was no longer willing to play for the organization. And now entering the 2021 offseason, and while the Sixers did make a few notable acquisitions, the majority of the offseason was spent trying to find suitors for Ben Simmons. However, due to the reluctance of the front office, combined with Ben Simmons' refusal to show up to training camp in preparation for the season, so much so that he be suspended and fined for each team event that he failed to show up to, it became very hard for the Sixers to find packages better than a CJ McCollum or a Malcolm Brogdon. And now we finally reached this past season. And due to Ben Simmons being unwilling to participate with the team until he was traded, Joel Embiid spent the majority of the season as the lone star. And oddly enough, he played pretty amazing. Once again performing at an MVP level, evolving his game to become more of a playmaker, and most importantly, leading the 76ers to one of the best records in an extremely tight Eastern Conference. Not to mention that Tyrese Maxey, in Ben Simmons' absence, was promoted to the starting lineup, and he played amazingly. But of course, for weeks, months, and even the past year, rumors would circulate that James Harden was looking to come play in the city of brotherly love, and especially after this season, once Kevin Durant went down with an injury and Kyrie Irving was in and out of the lineup. And although there had been talks and multiple media members who claimed that it was a possibility, no one really thought that it would actually happen until it did. See, this trade was actually rumored to happen during the 2021 season when James Harden was looking to get out of Houston. However, at that point in time, Morey decided not to pull the trigger. And after the events of the 2021 playoffs, Ben Simmons' antics throughout the entire offseason and the beginning of the season, and Ben literally not playing a game of NBA basketball in 7 to 8 months, again, it was almost impossible to think that the 76ers would ever get a deal like that ever again. But, as I just stated, due to the uncertainty in Brooklyn, James Harden would request a trade, and at the 2022 trade deadline, James Harden would join the Sixers, while the Sixers sent away Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, and Andre Drummond. And, as you would rightfully assume, this breeded excitement from Philly fans and the entire NBA community for that matter. For the longest, it had been clear that Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons just did not fit together, and being able to replace Ben Simmons with someone who was just as good of a playmaker, but an immensely better scorer, couldn't have been more perfect for Embiid's playstyle. And then having an MVP level big man to run pick and roll with and to allow to isolate in the post couldn't have been more perfect for James Harden's playstyle. And in their first game together against the Timberwolves, Embiid dropped 34 and 10 on 55% shooting from the field. James Harden had 27 points, 12 assists, and 8 rebounds on 58% shooting from the field and 5 for 7 from 3. And Tyrese Maxey would have 28 points while going 12 for 16 from the field in a 133-102 victory. This team had people scared at their potential, and with around 23 games left in the season, there was a solid window of time for them to figure everything out. The Sixers would go 15-8 from there until the end of the season and claim the 4th seed in the Eastern Conference. This would match them up with the Toronto Raptors in the first round, and they would beat Toronto in 6 games to match up with the first seeded Miami Heat in the second round. Unfortunately, though, the Sixers would catch the injury bug yet again, and this would strike at the very wrong time, as not only was it revealed that Joel Embiid had a torn ligament during the Toronto series, it was also revealed that during Game 6 against the Raptors, Embiid had suffered an orbital fracture and would have to miss time against Miami. This, of course, hurt the Sixers as they got blown out in Games 1 and 2, and about to go down 3-0, Embiid was cleared to play Game 3 literally 30 minutes before the game even started. The Sixers would go on to take both home games and head back to Miami for Game 5, in which they get blown off the floor, with some pretty lackluster performances from Harden, Embiid, Maxey, and Tobias. Finally, we have Game 6. And with their season on the line, down 3-2, and with all the hype that this team had going into the playoffs, you would hope that the Sixers would pull through to force a Game 7, but no. The Heat would edge out the win over the Sixers, with Joel Embiid going 7 for 24 from the field, and James Harden going 0 for 2 in the second half, once again ending the Sixers season in disappointment, confusion, and still without a conference finals appearance. Alright then, so what's next for this team? And honestly, to me, it's pretty simple. Now, don't worry, Philly fans, because I don't think there's too much wrong with this team outside of Doc Rivers and simply just needing more reps together. And with James Harden more than likely accepting his player option, I'd say run it back one more year. Go out this offseason and sign some more quality role players, and try this core again next year, who hopefully will have a full season together, barring any sort of injuries. However, after that is a different story. See, after the 2023 season, the only players who will still be on this team are Embiid, Tobias Harris, Korkmaz, and Tyrese Maxey. And in the case of Tobias, Maxey, and Korkmaz, they're all going to be on contract years. So literally, the only long-term player that Philly has right now is Joel Embiid. Which is why I say, if it doesn't work out next year, then it's going to be time to end the process. Ironically, that would be the 2024 season, which would mark the 10-year anniversary of the beginning of this process. And I don't think it's too crazy to say that if you have a process that's been failing for 10 years, then yeah, it'd be time to part ways with Joel Embiid and start a rebuild. Not by tanking, but by making quality trades and signings and proper scouting, just like the rest of the NBA. And with all that said, I thank you all for watching. Please let me know what you think the 76ers should do next in the comments below. And please stay tuned for the next video.